You'd think the knights would have won, fired by holy zeal, but all of that didn't count to the Mamluks. Not nobles, not princes, not even free men. Trained like war machines. And yet, battle after battle, they didn't just hold the line, they pushed the Crusaders back, destroyed their cities, erased their kingdoms. The Crusaders brought the sword. The Mamluks brought the system. And at Acre in 1291, it all came to a brutal, fiery end. But before that final siege, there was a long war, and every step was a lesson in how discipline beats desperation. The Mamluks weren't born into war, they were sold into it. They were mostly Turkic or Circassian boys taken from the steppes, snatched by slave traders, captured in raids, and then shipped to Egypt. But unlike most slaves in history, their chains didn't lead to fields or kitchens, they were purchased for a single purpose: to fight. From the moment they arrived, they entered an intensive training program that would make medieval boot camps look like child's play. Horsemanship, swordsplay, archery, tactics, Quranic study. Everything was drilled into them with obsessive discipline. And when they graduated, they didn't remain slaves. They were manumitted, given land, rank, and the chance to rise by merit. This system built loyalty like nothing else. A Mamluk owned everything: his education, his freedom, his status, to the state and his patron. And because they were foreigners with no tribal ties in Egypt, their only allegiance was to their brotherhood and their sultan. It created one of the most cohesive, disciplined fighting forces in the medieval world. Loyal not to blood, but to training. In a time when feudal knights fought more for personal glory than strategy, the Mamluks fought as a single organism. And that's what made them terrifying. It began in the alleys. The 7th Crusade had come to Egypt, led by King Louis IX of France, a king so holy, thinking he could cut the Muslim world in half by seizing the Nile. What he didn't know was that Egypt wasn't ruled by the Ayyubids alone anymore. Behind the throne, the Mamluks were rising. As Louis approached the town of Mansurah, the Mamluks prepared an ambush. When the Crusaders burst into the city, they found the streets strangely empty. Then came the slaughter. Mamluk warriors sprang from alleyways, from rooftops, from doorways. Heavy European knights found themselves trapped in narrow passages. Their horses, useless. Their visibility, gone. The Mamluks, armed with agility, speed, and superior coordination, turned the city into a meat grinder. King Louis was eventually captured, along with thousands of Crusaders. This humiliation stunned Europe, but more importantly, it was a turning point. Days after the battle, the Mamluks executed a coup. They overthrew the Ayyubid dynasty and seized power. Egypt and soon Syria would now be ruled by men who had once been property. The age of the Mamluk Sultanate had begun. Then came Baybars, the lion. He wasn't just a sultan, he was a storm wrapped in armour, a former slave turned general, then sultan. Baybars made it his life's mission to erase every Crusader stronghold from Muslim soil. And he didn't just want to win, he wanted them to fear. Baybars wasn't building peace, he was branding terror. His campaigns were relentless. Between 1265 and 1271, he struck city after city, fortress after fortress. Arsa fell, Caesarea fell, Safed, the fortress of the Templars, was captured and its garrison massacred. But his most symbolic victory came in 1268, the fall of Antioch. Antioch had stood as a Crusader state for nearly 170 years. It was ancient, proud, fortified, but Baybars used speed, deception, and overwhelming force. His armies breached the walls, slaughtered or enslaved nearly the entire population, and razed much of the city. He didn't just break their army, he wiped out the city. Was that victory or vengeance gone too far? In Europe, the news caused panic. Popes wept, kings trembled. Antioch didn't just fall, it vanished. One chronicler wrote, "No one was left alive to tell the tale." Baybars didn't just destroy cities, he destroyed hope, and his enemies couldn't keep up. While Crusader forces were often scattered, relying on reinforcements from across the sea, the Mamluks operated from a central command. They had the supply lines, the cavalry, the timing. They turned war into a science. If Antioch was the soul of the Crusader states, Krak de Chevaliers was their shield. Massive, multi-walled, perched on a hill in Syria, it was considered the most formidable fortress in the Levant. Built and expanded by the Knights Hospitaller, Krak had survived earthquakes, sieges, and decades of war. Pilgrims and generals alike called it impregnable. Baybars disagreed. In 1271 he surrounded Krak with an army equipped not just with brute force, but with precision. He brought mangonels, massive stone-hurling catapults, siege towers, and cunning. Baybars forged a surrender letter. The Crusaders fell for it. They gave up their strongest fortress without a fight. The garrison surrendered, expecting mercy. Baybars took the castle and gave them none. The fall of Krak sent shockwaves through Europe. If even this bastion could fall, what was left? It wasn't just the walls that cracked, it was the entire Crusader illusion of permanence in the Holy Land. Baybars had broken the myth, and the Mamluks were far from finished. Their next targets wouldn't just fall, they'd disappear. By 1289, the Crusader states were collapsing, and Calawan came to finish what Baybars had begun. He wasn't a warrior poet or a battlefield showman, he was a siege master, a planner, a calculator. Where Baybars had been fire, Calawan was ice, and his eyes turned to Tripoli, a city that had stood under Crusader control since the First Crusade, nearly 2 centuries earlier. The Mamluks surrounded Tripoli, with siege engines and battering rams. The defenders, desperate and undermanned, sent pleas to Europe. Few responded. Reinforcements trickled in, but it wasn't enough. Calawan breached the walls, his troops stormed the city. What followed was destruction. Tripoli wasn't just captured, it was erased. Burned, looted, depopulated, the city that had once been a hub of Crusader commerce and culture was now ash. And with it, one of the last Crusader hopes vanished. Calawan didn't stop there. Before he died in 1290, he laid the groundwork for the next and final campaign. His son would take up the mantle, and the next target was Acre. By the end of the 1280s, only a handful of Crusader cities remained. Acre, Sidon, Tyre, a few scattered coastal outposts, but they weren't nations anymore. They were islands of stone in a rising tide. Their leaders squabbled, their supply lines from Europe were unreliable, and their people lived in fear of the Mamluks. Acre, though, still stood proud. It was the capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the beating heart of the Crusader dream. Its walls were thick, its harbour was deep, it had repelled past sieges, and its streets still hummed with trade. But the Mamluks weren't the same enemy the Crusaders had faced a century earlier. They were better, more organised, more ruthless, and now they didn't just want victory, they wanted finality. In 1291, Sultan Al-Ashraf Khalil, son of Calawan, led a massive army toward Acre. And as they marched, they weren't just bringing weapons, they wanted to put an end to the war. The Siege of Acre would be no ordinary battle. It wasn't just the end of a war, it was the end of an era. Acre had become a strange kind of city. It was the last crown jewel of a dying kingdom, a place where European merchants rubbed shoulders with Templar knights, where spices flowed in and rumours flowed out. It had once been retaken by Richard the Lionheart himself during the Third Crusade, and now, a century later, it stood as the last major Crusader city in the Levant. But despite its wealth, its population, and its massive walls, Acre was hollow. Divided, fractured. The various military orders, the Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, guarded their quarters like rival fiefdoms. Nobles from different parts of Europe bickered over authority, and behind the walls, civilians knew the truth. The Mamluks were coming. In early 1291, when Sultan Al-Ashraf Khalil began assembling his army in Cairo, his intent was clear. He didn't send warnings, he didn't ask for negotiations. He marched. And this wasn't a raid, it was a full-scale, carefully prepared campaign of annihilation. The Mamluk Sultan had inherited not just his father's army, but his obsession with completing the mission. The Crusaders had been pushed to the edge. Acre would be the final shove. The Mamluks began their march north in March 1291. Sultan Khalil led the army himself, a clear sign of how seriously he took the campaign. His generals were hardened veterans, men who had fought under Baybars and Kalawan. Thousands of cavalry, siege engineers, archers and infantry followed behind, bringing with them massive siege engines, towers and supplies. By April, Acre was surrounded. The Crusaders watched from their walls as the enemy encircled them. Not a chaotic mob, but a machine. Camps were established, engines were constructed, observation posts were raised, and then the bombardment began. Rocks the size of barrels crashed into Acre's defences day and night. Catapults and trebuchets hurled stone and fire with terrifying precision. The Mamluks didn't rush. They wore the defenders down, brick by brick, wall by wall. Inside the city, panic grew. Appeals were sent to Europe, but too late. A small force of Italian reinforcements arrived, but it was a trickle against a tidal wave. The Mamluks, unlike their enemies, didn't rely on distant kings. Their commanders were here, their soldiers were trained, their supplies abundant. Every night the city shook, every morning it crumbled a little more. On the 18th of May, the walls cracked open. After weeks of relentless pounding, the Mamluks breached Acre's outer defences, and the moment the gap appeared, the assault began. Elite units surged forward, emirs led the charge, archers blanketed the approach, sappers widened the breach. The defenders fought desperately. Knights in full armour clashed with Mamluk cavalry in the streets of a burning city. For a few hours it seemed the Crusaders might hold. They pushed the Mamluks back from the breach, cheers echoed in the courtyards. But it was false hope. The Mamluks hadn't even committed their full force. They were only testing the defence. That night they regrouped, rearmed and planned the end. At dawn, May 19th, they came with everything. The city shook as waves of Mamluk soldiers poured through the breach. The Crusaders couldn't contain them. Fighting spilled into the streets, but the Mamluks didn't scatter, they advanced, district by district. They captured towers, they killed defenders, they burned barricades. The Templar and Hospitaller fortresses held out the longest, becoming last pockets of resistance. But even they began to fall. Civilians fled toward the port, hoping for ships already overloaded. Many drowned trying to escape, others were cut down in the streets. By evening, much of Acre was burning. The Templar stronghold in the southwest of the city became the final point of resistance. A fortified tower, thick-walled, multi-storied, stocked with provisions. Dozens of knights and civilians took shelter inside, hoping to negotiate terms or wait for reinforcements. The Mamluks surrounded it, but they didn't rush. They had learned from Baybars and Kalawan, siege warfare wasn't just physical. It was psychological. For 9 days they bombarded the tower with stones and fire. The defenders refused to surrender. The Mamluks offered terms, the Templars declined. Finally, a portion of the tower collapsed. Whether by assault or structural failure, no one's sure. Dust filled the air, screams echoed across the city, and when the smoke cleared, the Mamluks swarmed the ruins. Almost all the defenders were killed, a few survivors were captured. The Siege of Acre was over. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, after nearly 200 years, was gone. The Mamluks didn't stop at victory. Sultan Khalil ordered Acre razed. Its walls were pulled down, its towers collapsed. Churches, barracks, merchant houses, all gone. What couldn't be looted was destroyed, what couldn't be burned was buried. And then they turned to the others. Sidon fell, Tyre was evacuated, Haifa was reduced to rubble. Even the smallest castles, way stations, watchtowers, hunted down and eliminated. There would be no sanctuary, no rearguard, no second wave. The Mamluks weren't interested in symbolic wins or negotiated treaties. Their goal was permanent removal. And with Khalil's campaign, they achieved it. Europe was stunned. For the first time since Pope Urban II's call to arms in 1095, there was no Crusader state left in the Holy Land. The dream of a Latin Christian kingdom in the East had ended. Not with a final clash of kings, but in fire and silence. And it was slaves who did it, men who had once been sold in markets, trained in barracks, forged into warriors. They had built an empire, not for gold, but for survival. They didn't just destroy kingdoms, they deleted history. But were they liberators or just better tyrants? So how did slaves outfight kings? The answer is system, not just spirit. The Crusaders had courage, but they fought with fractured command. Their armies were often led by rival nobles or religious orders with overlapping authority. Discipline broke down under pressure. Logistics were unreliable. Reinforcements came by sea, usually too late. The Mamluks were different. They were a centralised machine. The Sultan or his top emirs directed every major force. Supplies were coordinated, siege engines were mass-produced. Soldiers drilled constantly, not just in technique, but in battlefield coordination. And above all, they had motivation. Mamluks fought for the state that had freed them. Victory meant honour, land, rank, even sultanship. Many of their greatest leaders, Baybars, Kalawan, Khalil's own grandfather, were former slaves who rose purely by merit. There was no aristocratic ceiling, ambition was fuel. Meanwhile, European knights fought for plunder, for piety, or for politics. When those failed, morale collapsed. The Mamluks fought for their brothers, for the machine, and the machine didn't stop. After Acre fell, the Crusades effectively ended. There were attempts, proposals for new campaigns, calls by desperate popes, but nothing stuck. The world had changed. European kingdoms were now embroiled in their own wars. The age of feudal crusading was over. The Mamluks, meanwhile, held the Holy Land for over 2 more centuries. Their empire would face new threats, the Ottomans, the Timurids, even internal revolts, but never again would Western Crusaders establish kingdoms on their soil. Their victory wasn't just military, it rewired the psychology of power. They proved that the weak could become strong, that slaves could become rulers. They ended the Crusades, but did they end the war, or just monopolise it? That empires built on bloodlines could fall before those built on brotherhood. And in doing so, they didn't just end the Crusades, they rewrote the story of power in the medieval world. They were bought in markets like cattle. Circassians, Kipchaks, Mongols, Georgians, torn from their homes as boys, stripped of their names, their families, their futures, and yet these same boys would one day command empires. They would ride at the heads of armies that made kings tremble. The Mamluks weren't just a military caste, they were a paradox. Slaves trained to rule, foreigners trusted to defend the heart of the Islamic world. Their rise flipped the medieval social order on its head. Unlike the Crusader lords born into titles and privilege, the Mamluks had to earn everything. Rank, respect, power. And in that crucible of hardship, a different kind of warrior was forged, not pampered by inheritance, sharpened by merit. The strongest survived, the most disciplined advanced, the most brilliant led. No lineage could guarantee your place. Only excellence could. The Mamluks didn't just stumble into dominance, they engineered it. Young recruits, once purchased, entered years of intense training in Cairo's military schools. Swordplay, archery, horsemanship, tactical studies, religious instruction. They weren't just trained to fight, they were built to lead. And when they graduated, they weren't thrown blindly into battle, they entered regiments led by experienced emirs. That's where they learned the rhythm of real warfare. Formations, retreats, feints, siegecraft. Each emir commanded a corps, loyal not only to him, but to the state. An army with layered loyalty and synchronised movement. Now compare that to the Crusaders. Disparate forces, nobles chasing personal glory, coalitions of competing egos. One side fought as a brotherhood of professionals, the other as a patchwork of ambition. So when the Mamluks besieged, they didn't improvise, they executed. When they charged, they didn't scatter, they enveloped. When they ruled, they didn't just conquer, they absorbed. After 1291, the map changed. No Crusader kingdoms, no Latin bishops holding court in Jerusalem, no castles flying the cross on the Levantine coast. The once mighty dream of a Christian kingdom in the Holy Land had been shattered. Not by plague, not by famine, not by inner decay, but by the Mamluks. And yet they didn't celebrate. No parades, no proclamations, their work wasn't done. They knew other threats loomed. The Mongols in the east, the Ottomans in the north, revolts from within. But the Crusader chapter closed. Permanently. They dismantled not only the fortresses, but the entire infrastructure of Crusader control. trade routes, administrative centres, naval ports. Some cities were never rebuilt, others became fishing towns haunted by ruins. In time, European powers would return, but not with crusading armies, with colonial ambitions, and even then they remembered the name Mamluk, because no one forgot the soldiers who ended 2 centuries of holy war. Today, the story of the Mamluks often hides in the shadows of Western narratives. The Crusaders are romanticised, brave knights, chivalrous quests, but the men who defeated them? Just shadows in medieval paintings, slaves with curved swords, faces forgotten. But the truth is this: the Mamluks weren't villains. They were tacticians, survivors, kings born of captivity. They didn't fight for plunder or papal glory, they held the line. Against Crusaders, against Mongols, against corruption, against oblivion. And in that fight, they didn't just survive. They made history kneel. Ultimately, the Crusaders possessed wealth, castles, kings, but the Mamluks had something far more dangerous: purpose. They were forged in bondage, trained like no other soldiers in the medieval world, commanded by generals who rose from the same ranks. They didn't fight for conquest alone, they fought to prove that even the lowest could stand above emperors. And in the end, they didn't just defeat the Crusaders, they erased them. Now let me ask you this: which factor do you think made the Mamluks so unstoppable? Was it their training, their leadership, or the system that turned slaves into sultans? Let me know in the comments below.